Welcome everybody to the October 2020 Tribal Climate Webinar. My name is Stefan Tangent. I'm the Tribal Resilience Liaison for the North Central region. I work directly for the Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance in coordination with the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. I am hosting this webinar from the traditional lands of the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne peoples just outside of Denver, Colorado. And just for some information about the Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance, the Alliance serves as an advisory committee to the Great Plains Tribal Chairmen's Association on all matters with regard to technical and policy issues related to the water resources of member tribal nations. And the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center is a partnership between the U.S. Geological Survey, the University of Colorado Boulder, and 5 consortium partners. The NCCASC fosters innovative and applied research in support of tribal, federal, state, and local natural resource management and decision-making. And they cover the states of Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, and Nebraska. I'm going to add both of their websites into the chat here in a minute as well, if you want to learn more about either organization. The goal of this monthly webinar is to provide information, tools, resources for tribal resource managers to use in addressing climate change. Sometimes we highlight work done by tribal resource managers, like their climate adaptation planning process, for example. Other times we bring leaders in the field to discuss important issues, like today's topic of data sovereignty and data-driven decision-making. And just a few things before I introduce our speaker. We're recording the webinar, and so just note that and be aware that we are recording. So if you say something that you don't want it to be recorded, that's fine. Feel free to put that in the chat, or you can chat that directly to me or the speaker. The recording will be on the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center's YouTube channel. I'll put the link for that in the chat as well. If you have questions during the presentation, feel free. You can type that into the chat. If it's something pertinent to the presentation, then I'll read it out, or Joseph can read it as he's going. Otherwise, feel free to wait to the end, and after the presentation, we'll have some time for questions or comments, and you can take yourself off mute and interact directly through this Zoom meeting. And it's the reason why we do a Zoom meeting and not a webinar, so that people can have interactions and talk directly to each other. Okay, now for our guest speaker, Dr. Joseph Robertson is the founder and chief data scientist of Mato Ohitika Analytics LLC. He also runs a nonprofit sister organization called Mato Ohitika Foundation. Dr. Robertson is an enrolled member of the Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate of the Lake Traverse Reservation in northeastern South Dakota. Joseph has worked on many different projects of immense value to tribal resource managers, using 21st century tools and drawing from his background in computational statistics. He will discuss a couple of those projects today. And due to the wide range of work he's done and the potential application of many of these tools, we're not going to cover everything. If there's time though, Joseph might share his current project, analyzing and modeling COVID-19 data. So with that, I'll welcome Joseph. The mic is yours. Feel free to screen share. You are doing that, and go ahead.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Stefan. Good afternoon to everyone. I appreciate the invite to talk about some of the work that I'm doing in real time these days. I want to thank the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center for the invite here. And so let's just get started. The title of my talk, The Impact of Data Sovereignty on American Indian Self-Determination, Using Data Science and Developing Tribal Resource Management Strategies for Climate Resilience. The outline of today's talk, I wanted to talk a little bit myself at a glance, a short land acknowledgement context, and then I wanted to talk a little bit about how context matters and how we define context. I'll give a couple of mapping examples and look at some introductory ideas, and then we'll pivot to the North Central climate regions, of which some of you are most likely a part of, and then looking at some primers for identifying use case for resource management and climate resilience. And then I'll stop there to maybe entertain any questions. And then part 2 is basically being able to show you some of the use case scenarios that have that I've gathered in my intelligence gathering processes and in working with a number of different tribes. And then just a brief, just a little bit of brief work on my work with scientific and education with the Matau Hitika Foundation. So let's just get started. First, I'm an enrolled member of the Sistan Waptanoyate of the Lake Traverse Reservation. I'm a Dakota citizen. Like Stefan said, I'm the founder and chief data scientist of Matau Hitika Analytics LLC. And I've been developing smart solutions using machine learning and artificial intelligence research and development. I currently hold a Doctor of Philosophy in Computational Statistics, a Master's in Statistics from South Dakota State University. I have a highly qualified teaching certificate in mathematics where I served and taught on the Indian education system here in South Dakota for a number of years, and I have a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics. I wanted to just give a short land acknowledgement about the ideas around what exactly does post-colonial American Indian homelands look like. And a couple weeks ago in a panel discussion, someone had brought up the idea of, what exactly does land acknowledgement mean? We're standing on ancestral land of a certain tribe or a band or Aboriginal people. And so just to introduce the Oceti-Sakowin people, I created this map, and this is just a real basic map to show you the current reservations in the continental United States. We have 9 reservations here in South Dakota, and I am from the Lake Traverse Reservation up here. And then that's what this picture is. We've got 7 individual districts that make up the reservation. I'm enrolled at Old Agency, and so that is how our current tribal government is represented. And historically, the Native Americans that comprise the Great Sioux Nation consisted of 3 divisions of the Oceti-Sakowin, or the 7 council fires, which include the Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota people. Here's another map that I created about understanding land acknowledgement, and I'll kind of tie that into what I'm talking about today in climate resilience. But essentially, here's a map that gives us some numbers about the actual pre-colonial American Indian land base of all US territories. And if you look at this map, the original territory was about 3.5 million square miles. And the post-colonial American Indian land base of all US territories is about 87,000 square miles, about the size of Idaho. So when we talk about land acknowledgement, that's a very huge number that got reduced in about less than 100 years. So these are the types of contexts that I want to bring up today in some of the work that I'm doing and the talk that we're having today. So first of all, if we want to define context, how do we define that? Is it cultural? Is it historical? And how are these contexts important when we're talking about the things that we're talking about? Particularly in this realm with the Climate Adaptation Science Center, if we can define the context, then how do we understand these ideas of resource management, climate resilience, the impact of technology on those ideas, and how do we bridge the science and culture between those two? So one of the things that I did a few weeks ago is someone asked me, well, if we could show a land acknowledgement, I'm sure somebody's already done it, as one of my colleagues said, and could we show what the ancestral lands look like, pretty much from 1492 until now? And this Dr. Sam Hilliard of Louisiana State University in 1972, you can do a Google search of Indian land cessions, and this is basically the only map that comes up. And so in creating context, as a data scientist, I decided to remaster these maps. And so we can remaster the past so we don't forget our shared history. And so one of the contexts I wanted to just show is using technology, I was able to take that same map that Dr. Hilliard made and modernize it so we could look and see how over time this land has been ceded to non-Indians up until the present day. And when you look at that, it's actually pretty important that this doesn't show the entire context of that, but when you show it over time, it's an incredibly powerful set of pictures. Similarly, I wanted to show you another map series that I'd been working on with COVID-19 over the last 6 or 7 months. And this shows the upward trends of COVID-19 positive cases in all 3,100 plus counties in the US. And again, if you're looking at the context of in the beginning of March into April, into May, and then into June, July, and then till now, you can see that right now we currently, as the data stands, we have pretty much upward COVID-19 continued upward confirmed cases everywhere, essentially in the United States. And so again, these contexts are important when we start creating things that we can help to interpret the jobs that we do, or the work that we're doing, or the collaborations that we have. So here are just some ideas for thought. These are some of the main ideas that have been coming out more and more as I have conversations with tribal communities and tribal leaders and grassroots organizers. Essentially, there's an urgent need for education and scholarship for American Indian students to build data science skills, including formal and informal education. And that informal is, I think, tied to more of the Mato Hitika Foundation, where I'm working on creating some educational outcomes to provide data science access to underrepresented communities and students. This was one of the main primers of the work that I do. Is the challenge for our Indigenous nations is to move beyond the rhetoric of nation building models and find new solutions and tools. And then the other part that has started to shift now is this inevitable challenge to move from talking about primarily policy and to actually move into scientific systems of data-driven methods and outcomes. And then finally, to fundamentally understand, and I'll use this word carefully, but the Indigenous perspectives of the ideas surrounding data science and data sovereignty. And so just a couple of definitions to kind of get warmed up. Vine Deloria Jr., a Lakota scholar, described sovereignty as a word to describe the process of growth and awareness that characterizes a group of people working towards and achieving maturity. Kessler Mata in 2014, in her dissertation about the constitutive theory of tribal sovereignty, is that this concept promotes intergovernmental relations with non-tribal governments, in which takes on principles of equitable interaction and political coordination central to its operation. If we look at data sovereignty, there's been a lot of talk in that space as well. In Australia, this Towards an Agenda paper, position paper in 2015, defined data sovereignty as managing information in a way that's consistent with the laws and practices and customs of the nation state in which it's located. And again, that creates that context of what I'll get to with the climate region. And then the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network defines data sovereignty as the right for native nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of its own data. And then finally, I'll just highlight Professor Chikio Hayashi is essentially the pioneer and founder of data science. And he defined this whole idea in 1996 about data science as the idea of the intention to analyze and understand actual phenomena with data. And one of his powerful statements here, I still today kind of guide the ideas of thinking outside the box, is he said that the aim of data science is to reveal features or hidden structures of complicated natural, human, and social phenomena with data from a different point of view from the established or traditional theory or method. And so essentially the point of view implies multidimensional, dynamic, and flexible way of thinking. And so essentially that is a really powerful statement when we're thinking about how do we actually use data to create outcomes that are meaningful for us in the work that we do. So having defined all this context, I wanted to look at the Climate Adaptation Science Center, the regional idea behind this. And of course, again, here is a GIS map. It's got tribal headquarters, tribal lands, north central states. This is a context. What do I need to know about the Climate Adaptation Science Center region? Who's involved? If we look at this other map that's from the website, we're also identifying consortium headquarters, tribal college, tribal headquarters, consortium partners, tribal lands, and the north central states. And again, there's lots and lots of context in here, many questions I could ask. And as many of you that are watching, I've I've presented some of my data sovereignty work to the Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance, and many of you, we've run into each other through some of the work I've been doing with the Mini Weezy Pawakam project on the Yankton Reservation. But essentially, this is the context I wanted to begin this webinar series, is that tribal nations are priority science partners because of one thing, because their connection to the environment is often thousands of years old. And so that's important to really understand how all of that ties into the scientific work we're doing, the geographic locations. So let's look at a couple of considerations. Number one, let's look at cultural location intelligence. Again, what do these tribal nations share in common? Do these tribes have a shared common ancestry? And what are their differences? And is their governance similar? I mean, we're not really sure, but that's part of this intelligence gathering idea of that. If we want to create climate resilience protocols, we really need to have that intelligence in hand to make and construct systems that work for everybody. If you look strictly out of culture and look at geographic location intelligence, again, we can start asking about climate resilience or climate change or resource management. I mean, do these respective reservations share a common terrain? Are their climates similar? And if so, which ones? Are they overlapping? Are there overlapping resource management strategies already in place? Have any of these tribal nations faced a climate-related crisis or event? So that kind of leads me to this idea about geospatial infrastructure. I'm currently, in the last couple of months, I have become an Esri Bronze partner, my company has, to really advocate for tribal communities in the GIS space to create these solutions that are very unique to our communities, and that I'm the advocate for that in understanding how do we merge this modern thinking and traditional knowledge together. And this is actually a slide from the ongoing GIS conference that's happening this week about GIS infrastructure management. And this idea behind this digital twin they're talking about, it's like, how do we create a digital twin of our world or our traditions? How do we create something where we're using this modeling to create outcomes that may benefit our community economically or climate related or traditionally, any of those things. And so I wanted to just throw that out there. How do we, where do you see yourself in a distributed GIS at scale? Like, are you part of a team? Are you part of a department? How do we share and collaborate? How do we interconnect these things? Right now is a great time because this technology is so mature. It really provides many, many solutions that are quite, I mean, simply amazing. So this is a couple of slides about my data sovereignty initiative. I just wanted to keep that maybe at the back burner and talk about more about use case ideas. But essentially the data sovereignty initiative is the cornerstone of my doctoral work, the impact of data sovereignty on American Indian self-determination, a framework proof of concept using data science. And this is a collection of methods and concepts that is a way to responsibly bridge science and culture together to create that context. So here is just a simple diagram of the data sovereignty in key indicator blueprints. Here you can see we've got these key indicators are in the circles. I've paired them with key descriptors. And what we're trying to do is drive an interdisciplinary analysis and strategic assessment of how we would use data in a context that's beneficial to a tribal group or even, let's say, a consortium group like this climate adaptation region. And the framework consists of merging many interdisciplinary ideas: higher education, citizen science, data science, governance, and analytics. And what I've gotten out of the past few months is really looking at two primary drivers of this framework. Is number one, data sovereignty is the act of democratization of data for the community's benefit. And then establishing solid data ethics principles are fundamental to providing communities with intelligence that works for them and how they provide access to that information. And essentially what the design here is to provide this interdisciplinary system of analytical and theories built using data science that intersects all of these different contexts: culture, nation building, higher education, pedagogical design, and citizen science. And what we're doing in real time is establishing a new praxis in understanding American Indian tribal sovereignty through this concept of data sovereignty, right? Data sovereignty isn't a law, it's a concept. And so how do we strengthen tribal sovereignty using information to make our decisions? And so again, here are some mutually exclusive, the key indicators are mutually exclusive. And so we strategically try and work towards interlocking these disciplines to form a smart solution. And essentially that's integrating cultural and scientific and interdisciplinary methods of design and consultation. So we create a harmony between culture and science in a meaningful way. And so again, I just wanted to go back to this geospatial infrastructure. That's kind of the aim I wanted to take today, and to provide some context to some of you that are watching. So the best way to do this is, let's look at a potential use case to illustrate a resource management or a climate change event or crisis to discuss. And I will feature one that is close to me, because last year I was on the visiting the Yankton Nation, or the Yankton Sioux Reservation, or the Yankton Sioux people. And in Lake Andes, there was an event. And some of you may have recall this, but in 2019, there was a bomb cyclone event in March of 2019. And this cyclone of snow and wind hit South Dakota and other Midwestern states really hard, right in the spring. And so what happened is that there was a climate change event that affected Lake Andes. Here's a map of what a Lake Andes looked like. And this is just from the the National Agricultural Image Program. Here's a 1 meter resolution picture in 2016 of what Lake Andes looks like. Here's Lake Andes. Here's one of the tribal communities down here, and here's Lake Andes. Here's what happened as a result of that bomb cyclone. And that happened, and it happened to flood, the road going into Lake Andes, and it flooded a lot of these areas here. And so this is a classic resource management idea around this. Here's just some pictures. If you look at a zoom in if you zoom into this area here, if you look here, there are some berms that had to be constructed to keep the water out. And that was near the safety center and by the community center. And so if you look, the powwow grounds were underwater. The sewer lift station was at risk of being flooded. So not only was there black mold growing in people's basements because of the flood, there might have been sewage backup had the water gotten up to these critical infrastructure points. A resource management perspective, what are the resource management issues tied to this event? Are there future planning directives that emerge from this event? And what was the emergency response? And if we look at issues of housing, zoning, water, wastewater, and other critical parts of infrastructure, then really that's the kind of context I wanted to bring today in our discussion. Is the context of real life events complicates many local response levels. How do we respond to these events without a unified strategy? And is it possible to utilize technology to bridge the gap in cultural and scientific knowledge systems? And so I think I'll stop there. And Stefan, if there are any questions, I'd like to open up if there are any questions about this current piece of work, then we can discuss that. And then part 2 is a demonstration of possible research management outcomes using GIS. And so I'll get to that in a minute, but I wanted to stop here and see where we're at.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions that they want to take themselves off mute and ask directly, feel free. No questions in the chat just yet, but we can take a quick break in case somebody had something they want to comment on or or ask a question.
Hey, Stefan, this is Cynthia. I have maybe just a comment. I'm Cynthia Naha. I'm the Director of Natural Resource for the Santo Domingo Pueblo. When you were talking about data sovereignty, because I know that's something that we've been really trying to look at, as you mentioned right now, it's just a concept, but how do we really bring that into fruition? And if we do bring it into into fruition do we do so through policy? And if so, what does that policy look like? Because I know when it comes to a lot of our issues, especially when we're collecting data, whether it's water quality, air quality, even forestry data, I know the Pueblo I work for is very hesitant about sharing that information, and to what depth and degree do we share and what's allowable, and most importantly, ensuring that we're not oversharing anything that's sensitive in nature that shouldn't be shared. So I really like the idea of, figuring out what do we do in regards to the concept of data sovereignty, and how do we really push it forward to enable and perhaps enact it into policy. And I know it's perhaps something you may not be able to answer right now, but it's just kind of like something I'm kind of putting out, because I definitely am a firm believer in advocating for policy change, especially when it comes to federal Indian law and policy, and really looking at what we can do to become a part of the development of these policies, especially because we're the ones that are most impacted by them. And really, I think we're in a pivotal day and age where we can really start to, or continue to, voice our concern and that advocacy at that level back at Congress, and really utilizing those, I guess, the people, so to speak, like Congresswoman Deb Haaland and Sharice Davis, to really help us in advocacy for something such as data sovereignty, because I know it's a concern that we have here in the Southwest. And I sit on the E-Enterprise for the Environment Leadership Council for EPA Region 6, and this is something I bring up with my colleagues who are also comprised of other tribes across the region, as well as states and EPA. So I just wanted to kind of further, so to speak, I guess, comment on the data sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Actually, this conversation is really about trying to understand that the policy. I think what we really need right now is to understand, how do we create use cases, and how do we create things that actually show and demonstrate how data sovereignty works. And part of the second part of my talk will go over some of the stories of the KXL pipeline work that I've been doing, and how that relates to this idea of how do you actually assert data sovereignty. Many people, the one thing, being a computational statistician, I work directly in creating these data-driven solutions that allow us to do something with the data, and then to think about how exactly can we address data sovereignty. First of all, if no one's signed up, then we're still siloed in each one of our tribal nations. One of the things that when Stefan and I were talking about this particular region and the group of individuals that are part of this, is there's got to be some commonality between the tribal resource managers that actually collect similar information. And so my company has really been at the forefront to define myself as a data controller, a caretaker of tribal data. And when we put it into a distributed GIS system, what essentially happens is what we're able to, in an enterprise GIS system, we're able to keep that data separate, but we're also able to take parts of that shared data or that agreement that we may have through nation building to create a common dashboard, or to create a common analytics report that everyone benefits from, because we're collecting the same type of information. One of the things that I'll show maybe at the end just quickly is a COVID-19 response could all be done in a distributed GIS system, where we could do the contact, we could do the COVID-19 reporting of the testing, the contact tracing, and all the geoanalytics, provided that we were collecting all the same similar information. Any tribe that was part of that collective then could benefit from the emergency response that we would have for COVID-19. And we could see all of those things in those maps and those dashboards. And so this is not too far off in the near future, actually. And so I think that's why this conversation is so important. I'm really trying to move to work with partners to actually develop some real proof of concepts that allow our tribal officials and people to say, oh, this is what we mean by asserting data sovereignty over types of information. So that's kind of where I'm at. And that's ongoing right now. This is certainly not going to tomorrow is another day where I'll be trying to figure out how to create these designs in real time that work for our communities.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Cynthia, and your answer, Joe. So there's another question here, and I don't know if this is a good time or if you want to wait till the end for this, but it's how do you envision tribal communities can expand beyond citizen science into opportunities for business development using data?
I will just say that's a great question. And I think part of the economic development footprint of all of this is we need to think about this in steps. Number one, what's happening right now is this data sovereignty like phenomena and the collection of data, and how does that relate to federal Indian law and policy? How do all these things intermix with this context I was talking about, right? It's not easy to say that Navajo Nation is going to go along with something that let's say the Rosebud Sioux tribe will go along with, but there might be some commonalities in there. What I'm doing with my foundation now is to create education, training, if you would, and educational outcomes to actually teach people in the community about data science and how it works, and how to stress ideas about artificial intelligence, data ethics, principles, GIS strategies, all those things. And how do we expand beyond that? Well, if we can develop some digital infrastructure to help people start doing that work and take ownership of that work, then I think we start moving into this space of defining very specific things. One of my colleagues on Navajo Nation is really deeply involved in trying to understand food sovereignty. And so how do you grow crops? How do you provide those to tribal members through, let's say, a WICS program or any of these types of outcomes that create an economic development footprint? That's how data sovereignty becomes what it's supposed to. And that's how it eventually is going to affect business development. If it's energy sovereignty, it has to do with, solar or wind, any of those things. And when it comes to water resource management, what happens if the tribe is able to quantify water through Winter's doctrine? Okay, there's some economic outcomes that the tribes get from having ownership of that water. And so again, it may seem like it's a long time away, but I think I'm confident that if we start looking at this from these strategies that we're talking about now, that this is definitely something that's going to happen sooner than later.
Yeah, that's all the questions in the chat. Unless anybody else has another one, we could proceed to part 2.
Sure. Well, if there's no questions, let me just, I wanted to, a lot of the time we're sitting here and talking about this concept, but what I really wanted to do is look at how I'm using data to inform decisions and then to help show you how exactly that works. But essentially when we develop a roadmap, especially with the data sovereignty initiative, essentially what I'm wanting to do is first develop a strategic assessment of an organization's operational data capacity. And so there's a definition on the next slide here, but essentially what we're doing is trying to figure out how do you actually use data to inform your decisions. Once we've done that, then we want to develop a strategic plan of action to begin building this data domain or this data idea. How do we assert data sovereignty on, let's say, doing emergency response for flooding at the Yankton Sioux community just south of Lake Andes. Step 3 would be to use the data sovereignty framework to leverage data science techniques in order to do that. And then finally, develop comprehensive planning to use data on behalf of tribes for their community development. So what does this actually look like? The planning directive of creating a distributed GIS system for centralizing data for ownership and sharing is number 1. We want to plan, we design, we want to build, operate, and then maintain, and then figure out if we can create this one system one time, then everybody can benefit from that. And so that is essentially what we're trying to do here. Again, the research and development of this, of the projects that I'm doing is how we use this geographic information system idea and we manage it through the online cloud infrastructure but we can also host the data locally so we can have control over that. And so this is kind of what's defined as distributed GIS, this collection of web mapping and real-time data for data-driven decision-making. And what that's, how we utilize that is through the technology. And if we can create that infrastructure, then we've got a system to work with at base, and then we can expand out with different projects from there. So I just wanted to go over a couple of real data science examples. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Mini Wizipan Wakan project, and then the Zuya Winya Wichayo Oneham project, which is honoring warrior women. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the Internet of Things devices for this particular point in the talk. So operational data capacity I've defined as this idea is the extent in which an organization has achieved maturity in data collection, management, and how that data has been used to inform decisions. And if you ask yourself, I mean, and I'm not sure, but ask yourself, you know, how many decisions have been made in the last 30 days in your organization where we looked at data we've collected and said, oh, this is why we made this decision. And it's very foreign to many people. This isn't an easy task by any means, because I mean, this data evolution has exploded in probably even in the last 5 years has been it's just overwhelming. And so again, what we want to do is get back down to the ground level and go, if we could collect some information to inform a decision, what would be the simplest thing that we could do that would help us move forward in building a critical mass in using data in these ways. So what I wanted to do is, again, set some context for you. Now, this may seem like it's out of context, but the Keystone XL pipeline, like many of you, like many of the community members that I visited with over the last couple of years, you know, there's not just the pipeline in South Dakota. There's pipelines and mines and all sorts of different infrastructure projects that are affecting tribal lands. When I was at a climate resilience summit in the Southwest a couple of years ago, one of the data sovereignty issues of could we collect data on the ideas of that radon in Navajo Nation housing was, you know, is there a way to measure that? Is there a way to see whether or not people are getting sick from the radon that's naturally coming up from the ground, and how would we use that, an IoT device to measure that? Now, how that applies to this is the context of what happened during this project, and this was just in January, is I developed a cultural risk assessment for harm reduction to Native women and families in the corridor and adjacent to the Keystone XL pipeline, and to prevent any further murdered and missing Indigenous women. Now, again, here's the context, is like, if we're not developing data science solutions that inform our community about the possible outcomes that happen because of this pipeline, okay, then we don't have the right context to have the right fight. So in January, I was called to testify on behalf of the Yankton Sioux tribe at the South Dakota Department of Environment and Natural Resources, and regarding to the water pipeline permits that they were applying for to provide the man camp water that was near the Yankton and Rosebud reservations. And I was testified as a lay witness on behalf of the tribe to the public interest and beneficial use of water. And that, again, was to provide water to the proposed man camps. And so the assessment I did was to use GIS to present the basic evidence of the lack of police capacity that would happen if, let's say, 1,200 men show up at this man camp, and they're about an hour drive on either side of the Yankton or Rosebud casino. And so because of that, I was able to present the context of why the water permits and the beneficial use of water was going to affect our communities, because the lack of police capacity would be a major issue. And so this risk assessment showed some of that evidence. Here's a strategic map I made of the routes to and from the man camp. And here's an idea that when I visited as part of a consortium with Yankton and Rosebud and then Rapid City Police Department, these were maps to show essentially that Rapid City has about the number of people per officer is about 1 for every half square mile, whereas on Rosebud, you're talking about almost 200 square miles. and in Yankton, probably about 65 square miles. And so just depending on if someone gets called off to a call and there's man camp activity happening, I mean, it's going to take 3 hours for someone to respond to that call. And so that in the Keystone Pipeline idea this is the context that leads me into this idea about the cultural bioregions of the Hunktawan and the Mini-Weezypon Makan project, which is also tied to the Keystone Pipeline, where I'll talk a little bit about water quality. And so the purpose of this project, I'm working with Faith Spotted Eagle and the Braveheart Society, which is a traditional women's society on the Yankton Reservation in Lake Andes. And I've been working with her for well over a year to develop this idea of how do we co-manage the river and our waters together in this context, and to empower tribal governments and grassroots Native communities of the Missouri River to restore traditional Native practices of water and land management. And so this was a project guided by the dream of elders of the White Swan Oyanke, and we're working on producing an atlas and a database of the hydroscape and indigenous cultural sites of the Missouri River Basin to create a baseline aimed at the ability to apply integrated indigenous knowledge and water policy. And so let me just show you a couple of things that I've been working on here. For those that aren't familiar, this is the ArcGIS Pro platform, and this is a GIS system designed for us to look at things from a geographical standpoint. And this is really quite busy right here. But what I wanted to show you is when I was in those water hearings for the risk assessment, essentially what happened during that time where I was at the state capitol in Pierce, South Dakota, was the intelligence I was able to gather was invaluable from TransCanada. And in fact, they provided these mappings of the pipeline route and the mile markers and all these things. And I was able to geoprocess and assert data sovereignty for the purpose of our community to fight against the pipeline and to have a picture of that. This is a good example of looking at a strategy in how we use data science to inform a decision. One of the concerns that some stakeholders were having was there construction happening on the Keystone Pipeline currently during the pandemic? And so one of the ideas was, well, how exactly can we figure that out? And so here's a good example of looking at, this is the kind of the overall arching box of the pump station that was proposed to be put in, because it's tar sands. You need a pump to continually pump that tar sands because it's like molasses. And so what I was able to do is to be able to create a strategy map and to look at these areas. One second while it renders, but you can see that this allows you to take a look at pinpoint accuracy of exactly where that pump station is in relation to the pipeline. And so then this particular image is an even closer up. And so you can see this is about a 400 feet distance, and you can see exactly where this road, you could put this into Google Maps and see this is where the proposed pump station is going to be. And could anyone go out and actually go and find any of those? They could see if there's actually construction happening. One of the other things I'll show here, this is another rendition of this, and this is at the point of diversion. And this is one of the things I wanted to explain to all of you, that one of the things that we did in this project that's applicable to what's happening in resource management is that this is the point of diversion where they propose that they're going to dig the pipeline underneath the White River. And what essentially that means is that we had to quickly develop water quality testing to make sure that we had a baseline of information upstream and downstream from that gradient. And so essentially what that we were doing is to create a set of tests in order to do that. And so so through the course of all of these water hearings, we were able to make all of these different strategy maps of the White River and the Cheyenne River. Here's one around the Cheyenne River. And so essentially what we're trying to do is to create outcomes of, could we test the water right here on either side of where the crossing of the Cheyenne River is going to be? And so that in itself is just, that's how we done this. And now we've almost got a water testing protocol done that we can share with other tribes. And so that's really that's the interesting part of all this, is that this is happening in real time. The last thing I'll just cover is talking about Internet of Things. And that is basically describes this network of physical objects. If we could go test the water and maintain the water quality, could we use an IoT or Internet Things device to collect data on that? And so these are these physical things, right? That's evolved due to the convergence of multiple technologies, real-time analytics, machine learning, commodity sensors embedded in systems, right? This idea of smart home, you've got devices and appliances, thermostats, home security systems, cameras, you name it. There are also IoT devices you can put out in the field and collect information, and you can do that meaningfully with just about anything you can think of. In the context, again, lots of people, it's easy to think about the IoT as intangible, that you don't really know what it does. And so, because it's part of this vast cloud. Okay, but all these things live on everything that we do every day. So it's a matter of harnessing that in a way where we can utilize and use this technology to solve specific problems. Here's just something from this Internet of Things agricultural idea. Basically, they're using these cost-effective solutions to measure and monitor crops through their growing cycle. And so you could imagine a lot of these things can be applied to what we're doing resource management wise in what we're doing. So how do we design IoT systems that allow resource managers more freedom to do what they do best? And so I think I will just, well, actually, you know what, maybe I'll just go through this and then I'll open up the last couple minutes for questions. I have a final gallery of just some other projects I've been working on. One of the projects I've been working on for census was this idea of using machine learning. You can see this is an image of that, a machine generated of a tribal housing development. And I use that essentially to create a master address file for transportation, housing infrastructure, census, voting, you name it. If you have this master address file, you can do many, many things in the GIS space with it. The other thing that I've been working on, again, is here's a hotspot analysis of the COVID-19 project that I've been undertaking. Here's the confirmed cases. Here's the confirmed deaths, the upward trends. I've been working on a distributed GIS system for COVID-19 response of tribal level GIS data integration. So how do we actually put as you can see, these are the reservation districts that are not the same as the county level information. This is the counties that are collecting COVID-19 information. We need data collection across all of these areas. And then in addition to that, you could also do wastewater testing in the same capacity, right? You could use their lagoons to test and see whether or not COVID-19 is present in a particular housing district. And then this is another idea that I had developed, is developing a contact tracing system through a distributed GIS system. So we can actually see the common places people have been and how they're related to each other through this contact tracing system in ArcGIS. And then finally, I've been working on time series forecasting modeling for the COVID-19, and just to look at what that actually means in our space and what's happening in South Dakota and how that relates to the tribal response for COVID-19. And then finally, I launched this foundation a couple weeks ago, and it's a nonprofit dedicated to providing scientific and educational services to underrepresented communities through data science related activities. And so we want to bridge culture and the principles of data sovereignty together to have these ideas. One of the things that I've gathered for tribal communities is this idea that we need some formal education down on the ground to help teach citizens about these systems. And so that's why I founded this foundation, to create some educational priorities about data ethics and teaching about data sovereignty, AI and machine learning, geographic information systems, and then STEM education and writing code and, teaching students and community members how all of those things work. So essentially that's kind of what I have for today. And the final thoughts here are just context does matter in our planning for future generations. And building common, this is critical, building common digital infrastructure for centralizing data for consortium partners is critical to show the process from conception to maturity. And then finally, as data is collected, protocols on the sharing or retention of data will be paramount. And so that's when we have a use case, then we design the principles around that idea or we do that in the planning process. So when we have collected data, we know where that data is going and we know how to keep track of it. So with that, I want to thank everyone for your time today. That's just a brief overview of some of the IoT, some of the context of the data sovereignty stuff I've been working on, and how we're designing these systems to help provide a proof of concept for everyone to see, particularly in the Keystone pipeline. We've got a water testing protocol that's almost ready to go that we can share with tribes to do their own testing, whether it's for Keystone pipeline or whether it's for just to test their own water quality. So those are real-time examples. And so thank you for the invitation, and I'll just give it back to Stefan. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So there was a quick question back there regarding a couple of those projects with the Braveheart Society and the KXL water monitoring. Just curious, it sounds like Corey was wondering whether Yankton Sioux was involved in either of those.
Not currently. I think the water testing, essentially one of the strategies that the Braveheart Society was doing was passing identical resolutions for harm reduction in these particular. So this is the strategy here, is to first have tribes pass identical resolutions that say, if we were going to do harm reduction for KXL, that was one of the strategies that the Braveheart Society was using to garner like a collective idea of agreement. And then having these agreements also allowed us to share information about, let's say, the water testing protocols, or to enter into agreements to say, if we're going to test the water, well, let's say if Rosebud's part of one of our partners, they can help us collect that information, and then we both benefit from that. And so Santee is not one of them currently. I think we've been working with Rosebud and Lower Brule in this particular space, but the idea here is to expand this out so we create more consortium partners.
Thanks. Yeah, that's great. Is there any other questions that folks would like to bring up real quick? We still have a little bit of time. We want to respect other folks' time. If you do need to drop off, and within the hour, that's fine. We can stick around and ask some more questions too, if there are more. But yeah, you can feel free to take yourself off mute if you would like to ask. There's a question if the webinar is recorded. This is recorded, and I'll re-enter the YouTube link there for you if you want to go to that later today. It should be loaded up or send it along to others. Robbie's curious if your project funding comes from ESRI, from grants, or from tribal contracts.
That's a good question. Primarily right now, it's been mostly in the grassroots spaces, where project comes from staying outside of the tribal government space, in particular, so we can move lightly and around and design solutions to create this infrastructure. I mean, right now, the way we kind of work on the Mini-Weezy-Pon Wakan project is I work exclusively with Braveheart, and I help them design these systems, and then what we do is help educate the tribe and the tribal government on how we would possibly use these for the economic development footprint. ESRI, as far as being a partner, I'm provided access to a suite of different technologies that they have that I can use to help organizations realize some of these things. So that actually certainly helps helps me promote some of these technologies, being a partner. And so contract wise, right now I'm working exclusively in the grassroots space. But I think in this, the way we're moving is that there seems to be more and more interest. And I think, Stefan, you and I talked about that, that this could be moving out of the grassroots and more into a mainstreams, but I'm still waiting on that.
I think what's so interesting about all these projects is while they cover very different issues and concerns, they all have a lot of similar components in terms of monitoring and setting that foundation. I think that what is interesting about you doing those different projects back to back is, particularly with the KXL and the Braveheart projects, is that you've got that infrastructure on the ground already. So now you can use that data to inform lots of different decisions. If you're monitoring water quality and quantity and temperature and all these things, you can not only inform how that may be impacted by pipelines, it might be impacted by upstream in the Black Hills with this mining that they're doing in Converse County. It could inform the way that you need to address surface water for how to adapt to climate change as the streams warm, and whether or not you need to be more reliant on groundwater. So I think that's what's so interesting about these projects and what you've done, and the application that it may have for other projects that people might be interested in.
Yes.
Corey is asking if you will be offering training sessions on GIS and data sharing in the future.
Well, this is our first conversation about this in this space, and so we were hoping maybe to do a very particular use case where the next time, if we want to work on some of these, that actually create and show you a design, like an actual design of mine. As far as the training on sessions on GIS, I mean, I hadn't. Well, that was always part of being in this space. But if there is some need for that, we can certainly talk about that as well. And I'd be happy to, if I knew kind of what exactly people need training in, I certainly can assist with that in some way.
Yeah, I would add to that. So Joseph's email is there on the screen, and you can also go to his website there underneath, bravebearanalytics.com. You can also reach out to me directly. I mean, that's one thing that we're extremely interested in and always thinking about is what kind of support or tools or information that do folks want or are they interested in, and then how do we go about providing that. So for example, right now, Mark Junker's got a series of workshops that he got funded through BIA's Tribal Resilience Program. And while that's not extensively focused on GIS, that is an option in the future to think about how to provide tribal applications for GIS and natural resource management. So there's lots of opportunities there. I think it really is dependent on what folks want or are interested in, and that just requires a quick email and reaching out or a phone call. So always open to those requests, me personally, and I think Joseph as well. So thanks for that question, Corey.
Right. I just wanted to quickly mention that, you know, and especially with being in this space, if anyone is interested in that, certainly I would want a custom design, like a set of trainings that actually work for you. And, you know, we've all been through some BIA trainings where some of the GIS is very general and it's, you know, it's pretty boilerplate. So what I intend to do is to help you figure out exactly where your entry point is and how can I help in that space. And so again, that takes us reaching out to each other. And I definitely would rather do that, design something that you'll benefit from than just maybe given a general idea of what GIS is.
I think that's right. Yeah, there are plenty of GIS online courses out there through Coursera, whatever it may be, but I think the kind of training that we're talking about here is very applied and specific, and co-designing that through a participatory process is really much better and much more useful for everyone involved. So I appreciate you saying that, Joseph.
Yeah.
And I will add to that, if you have suggestions on, you know, other topics related to this conversation, related to some of the tools and resources that Joseph has talked about, but maybe you wanted to go into more in depth, feel free to shoot him an email or me an email. It's always an opportunity to have a round 2 of this discussion. We covered a lot of content here, and certainly we could have done a deeper dive into many of the projects and many of the topics. So don't hesitate to reach out so that we're continuing to provide information that you find useful. And with that, I want to say thank you so much, Dr. Robertson, for your presentation. Thank you, everyone, for attending. As I said, that this video will be on YouTube. You can go to that channel anytime later in the day and find it to go back and review information or share it with any of your colleagues. And thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much.